All of our files are free and will remain free. If you like the show, you can show support by donating $1 to help with expenses. Just use the PayPal link on our website, YouTube channel, or Facebook page. Thanks.
Welcome back to part 2 of this program we are called From Tantra to Alchemy. And today we are conversing with Peter Levenda, a regular guest of ours, based upon his new book called The Tantric Alchemist, which is about Thomas Vaughan and how Tantra and alchemy actually may be very related, not just in contents, but also actually in history. And we'll get and we'll explore this further. Mm-hmm. But before we continue, we have about an hour or less left. I haven't read your book, so I just wonder if there's any particular avenue you want us to go down so that you feel satisfied we covered the most important bases, or if it's all the same to you from here on.
That's a good question.
If it's something very important, we should.
No,
otherwise, I do have other questions. It's not that I'm empty of questions, but sure. It's rare that I don't know the work when I discuss it. So I want to give you the chance to.
Yeah, I think that basically what we've discussed so far is probably as good an introduction as any. The book itself treats of individual works of Thomas Vaughan, and I sort of go through the background, why these works, why were they written this way, what was going on, and then I try to decode it. I look at the information that I cite from the works, and then I explain them in terms of what they meant as far as Indian or Chinese alchemy would be concerned and why that's important. So it's really is a book that I think you could use to help translate Thomas Vaughan, and then go from there to look at other alchemical texts. There's a lot in there about Indian alchemy, about the Kalachakra Tantra, for instance, which is the core scripture of the Tibetan Buddhists under the Dalai Lama. So that is looked at. I've done a lot of research in Kalachakra Tantra for other works that I've been contemplating too as well. So that's been a major focus of mine. So that's in there, as well as
I'm seeing the contents here. Very interesting titles you're giving it. Though you're giving it 9 and not 7 steps, but you have.
Sure.
But I see you have divided it into the terms of the great work, Nigredo, Albedo, and Rubedo. Your chapter 4, 5, and 6 are called the Hermetic contribution, the Chinese contribution, and the Tantric contribution.
Yep.
What would you say are the... I'm not going to ask you what are those contributions. I see it's hundreds of pages, but what would you say is the greatest distinction between the Chinese, or the Taoist, Hermetic, and Tantric? Contribution.
The Chinese and the Tantric are virtually identical, at least in the broad brush approach of it. The idea of placing the alchemical laboratory equipment inside the body and trying to show that we're talking about biological processes as well as chemical, that comes together pretty well. The Hermetic contribution is the one that we're most familiar with in the West, obviously, because of the Greco-Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus, thrice great as Hermes, and as above, so below, the Emerald Tablet. And that idea that the universe outside and the universe inside are mirrors of each other. This is kind of always a throwaway topic, right? People say, well, microcosm, macrocosm, it's all the same or something, without actually realizing what that means in actual terms. We pay lip service to that concept, but we don't really appreciate it for what it means, that actually the external world is internal as well. And trying to make that, or trying to experience that as a reality. Because we have, in our terms of our consciousness, we have separation. We are separated from each other. We're separated from the material world. We're operating within it. We're sort of wandering through it like Forrest Gump, through the landscape without being aware of what's going on. But there actually is, we're much more tightly connected to it, and it requires a certain level of consciousness to see that. And once you see that, again, you're involved in the process. So the Hermetic stuff is kind of a gateway drug to the Indian and the Chinese, because I use familiar terms from Hermeticism. I talk about the Florentine Academy and about Marsilio Ficino and all of that, trying to give an idea as to how did we get here. Who was Agrippa, for instance? Why does Thomas Vaughan talk about Agrippa so much?
So he was very influenced by Agrippa.
Absolutely.
Because I thought he was very influenced by Kuhnroth and Paracelsus, but he goes even further back.
He goes further back. He's very influenced by Agrippa, and Agrippa as an alchemist. Most people don't think of Agrippa as an alchemist. They look at the 3 books of occult philosophy, and it's kind of, sympathetic magic, and it's occultism the way we kind of understand it, it's astrology. There's all of that. There's just a little bit of alchemy in there. But Agrippa was himself an alchemist. He never went anywhere without his alchemical laboratory.
And he was burned on a stake, mind you, people. Wasn't he one of those who were killed for his holy work by the Catholics?
I don't think Agrippa. Giordano Bruno was.
Oh yeah, I mixed them. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, in 1600 he was burned at the stake. Yeah, Bruno was definitely the victim, not Agrippa. But Agrippa was, of course, he was feared as a magician. He was feared as this person who was somehow in contact with the devil, and he had problems in certain towns that he passed through. He had difficulties with people who thought he was a Satanist or something. But Agrippa was an alchemist. He understood alchemy very well, and Vaughan refers to Agrippa a great deal. He also refers, oddly enough, to the Abbott Trithemius. And Trithemius, of course, the abbot of von Spanheim, was a Catholic clergyman. He was the abbot of a monastery who basically invented the modern science of cryptography. And he did that in order to conceal his works from prying eyes.
Is this what was picked up later by John Dee and Bacon and those guys?
Right. Trithemius was a very influential figure because he was an occultist, and he was very involved in cryptography. He was very involved in mysticism in general, and he got into a lot of trouble because one of his letters was intercepted somehow, and there was occult stuff in there, and they started to build up stories about Trithemius being in league with the devil and having statues that could talk to him and all this other stuff. And Trithemius and Agrippa knew each other. They corresponded, and then Vaughan was an inheritor of some of that information. He read deeply in Agrippa and Trithemius. These are interesting people to claim as your spiritual tradition, your spiritual initiators. So this is something that Vaughan really exemplifies, that there is no real difference between ceremonial magic, the way we understand it, the higher forms of magic, and alchemy. And that's what Arthur Waite understood.
You mean theurgy? Because ceremonial magic doesn't have to be higher form. It can be a so-called lower form of magic. But as I understand it, theurgy is the word for divine magic. Just nitpicking here, but I get it right. We have a very bright listenership too who will pick up on that.
Well, look at it this way. What would you call the magic as performed by the Golden Dawn, as an example?
You really ask me to make a judgment call on the Golden Dawn. I'm not that impressed by them, to be quite honest, but I do appreciate their historical and philosophical value, just like I do with Theosophy, the value of it. But to me, it's not the purest form, though. But that's me. I don't mean to dismiss. We probably have Golden Dawn listeners here, too.
No. Well, I'll come to their defense just a little bit.
Okay, cool.
I understand what you're saying. By the same token, though, what the Golden Dawn accomplished was tremendous.
Oh, yeah.
They had actually codified an entire occult system. They made an actual system out of this morass of documentation, the various grimoires and Egyptian stuff and Indian stuff and, Kabbalah.
Notwithstanding the Enochian alphabet.
And they managed to create this elaborate, heavily articulated system of magic. For that, I think they were geniuses. As far as who they were and how they manifested this in the world, that's a different story. And of course, Aleister Crowley being their most famous representative, most famous creator.
Problem child, yeah. Well, it's not just a different story, it's the human story.
Yeah, it is. It's a very human story. On the one hand, you have Yeats, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and you have, on the other hand, Crowley, all coming out of the Golden Dawn, and Arthur Waite. So it was a laboratory, basically, and it gave rise to all sorts of weird and noxious elements, maybe. But It was ceremonial magic from the point of view of we're going to proceed up a ladder of lights. We're going to use the Kabbalah as our guide, and we're going to go from very base forms of magic. We're going to try to get to the higher forms. So theurgy, I agree with you, is the term that we would use for higher magic. And Arthur Waite really seemed to think that that's where Thomas Vaughan was going. When Arthur Waite compiled Thomas Vaughan's works, he kind of looked at Waite as the exemplar of this higher spiritual wedding of alchemy and magic. In fact, he came to Thomas Vaughan almost the way I did. He came to it almost by accident. Mary Atwood had written this very famous book on alchemy, and this book that was burned by her father. Only a few copies remained, and she was very influenced by Thomas Vaughan when she wrote her book on alchemy, and then Waite read her book and then came across Thomas Vaughan there. And actually, Arthur Edward Waite became very involved in the study of esoterica because of what he read about Thomas Vaughan. So there's this continuum that Vaughan had exerted so much influence on so many of the most famous writers of the 20th century on alchemy and magic. There was Thomas Vaughan, was always there. So whether it was Mary Atwood in her book on alchemy, and then to Arthur Edward Waite, created basically Arthur Edward Waite, and he joined the Golden Dawn. He became involved in all of this study. And then from Waite to Crowley mentions Thomas Vaughan in his Gnostic Mass. He's one of the saints of the Gnostic Mass, and we don't know why, because Crowley never mentions him again in any way, shape, or form in any of his writings.
And those saints, that's quite a group of people. So he must have thought highly of him if he made it to that list.
Yeah, he must have, but we don't know why, And then finally, as we say, Kenneth Rexroth, then refinding and rediscovering Thomas Vaughan. All of this happened, since Mary Atwood.
Yeah.
And her famous text, whose name escapes me now, A Skeptical Inquiry, I think, into, what is it? I have the book.
Can't help you there, no. I don't know.
If you just hold on a second, I have it right on my shelf.
Sure.
Yes, it's called, A Suggestive Inquiry into Hermetic Philosophy, Mary Ann Atwood. And she mentions Vaughan in several places, and she here she is, Thomas Vaughan, whose pseudonym of Eugenius Philalethes has, notwithstanding the very obvious distinction of his mind and style, causing him to be confounded with the foregoing Irenaeus, was the author of several luminous little treatises, etc., on the higher grounds of this mystic science. So she praised Thomas Vaughan, and it was we find from Arthur Edward Waite's autobiography that Vaughan is the one that got him started on this whole path. And he came across it because of that book by Mary Atwood. I don't know, I'm sure many of your readers who are familiar with alchemy know this book. Mary Ann Atwood was the daughter of a man who was very involved in alchemy. And she was sort of sitting there and taking it all in. She finally wrote her own book on alchemy, which is the one I just mentioned, A Suggestive Inquiry, and had it printed and ready to publish and put in the bookstores. And then her father read it and said, "Oh, no, you don't. You're giving a
You're spilling too many beans here."
Absolutely. He became incensed. He went and found every single copy of the book that he could, and they actually burned them outside the house.
Jeez.
In a complete auto-da-fe, a complete holocaust of flames. They burned every single copy, but one or two did manage to escape, and they've become now, a very famous. This is a very famous text. I think the Yogi Publication Society is the one who finally published a beautifully bound copy of it.
Oh, was she related then to? Because there is an Atwood, you say?
It's Atwood.
No, I'm thinking Atkinson. But she reminded me, though, of Maria Corelli. Isn't that her name?
Maria Corelli, yes. I understand. Sure. Yeah.
Who too learned from her father. There were many bright esoteric women in the old days, despite the circumstances, I'd say. But Rebecca is one of the earliest I've heard in our Western world. But I think you should tell us a little something about a certain image, because I managed to squeeze out of you when you were announcing this book en passant in another show we had. You made a point out of that, and like Tobias Shurton told me too, he didn't write that much, Mr. Vaughan, but there is this image in one of the books, it may have been the Lumine book, where I don't know if that was a breakthrough, but you could use that image to decode.
Oh, yeah.
That was a very important ingredient, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's only one image that Vaughan ever published. It's very funny. He wrote a lot of books, of course, on alchemy, but and alchemical books are famous for having all sorts of pictures. But he published one book, From Lumen to Lumine. It was published in 1651. And it shows you the magic mountain, the invisible magic mountain. It shows you an angel. It shows you a blindfolded man. It shows you at the bottom a dragon biting its tail.
I know an image called Mons Philosophorum, the mountain of the adepts. That's another one, right? It's not the same, or are we talking about the same?
There are many versions of it. Vaughan's version is called Scholae Magicae Typus. And it's the mountain in the middle is called Mons Magiorum Invisibilis. So that's maybe where you could confuse one with the other, but it's a magic mountain, but it's not the one that you're thinking probably with the 7 steps inside and all of that.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it's a different one. It's the only image that Vaughan ever published. And I have it in the book.
Sorry, I just found it online, so go on. I have it in front of me.
So the way I've done it in the book is that we have 2 images facing each other. One is the Lumen de Lumine from Thomas Vaughan, and on the other side, there's the Neijing Du, which is the chart of the inner warp from Chinese alchemy. And if you look at the 2 images and you compare them side by side, you realize that they're really talking about the same thing. In the Chinese image, there's a mountain at the top. There is a dragon spiraling down, a serpent at the bottom. There's...
Hang on, have you found a Chinese version of this that predates Vaughan's?
Yes.
Wow. So you can just compare them then, like you do now?
Like I'm doing now. I'm looking at them right now, and you can actually see there's so much that's the same.
Do you reproduce both in your book?
Yes.
Cool. Excellent.
Now, you have to look at the Vaughan version is a very Europeanized version.
Yeah, typical alchemy.
The Chinese version, of course, is typically Chinese. But if you compare the 2, if you look carefully at the symbolism in each place, you're going to see that they're talking about the same thing, even to the point where in Vaughan's image, you have the sun and the moon at the top, the sun on the left, the moon on the right. And if you look at the Chinese version, the sun and moon are in the same place. There's a mountain in the middle, just the way it is in Vaughan's work. And you can just follow the imagery on down. There's a temple where Vaughan has an altar with a candle. There's a yin-yang symbol at the bottom, and Vaughan has the serpent biting its tail in the bottom. I mean, there's a child in both. It's fascinating. It's actually quite fascinating to look at the 2 images. So yes, I made that very clear in the book, and I've had the images facing each other. So you can just look at it easily and compare one to the other yourself.
Huh. Yeah, it's a very rich, typical good image to meditate on.
Yeah.
For getting ideas. I just found a bigger version now. So I recognize here many classical alchemical symbols meant to depict the process and the different outcomes. Do you have the process here where you have to split? In alchemy, there's a very common principle is that first you take the prima materia, what you start with, then you have to split it. You have to disintegrate to, you said the dross, the crude stuff from and then you have to treat both of them on their own before you refuse them into a new and higher combination, so to speak. And those elementary principles are also reproduced here.
Yes.
So, yeah, interesting.
In fact, there's a lot, too, about Rebecca. Rebecca's influence is also very strong where this is concerned. We're talking probably about a real chemical wedding between, in the real world, between Thomas and Rebecca, and also on an esoteric realm between the 2 of them, where some of these same elements are reproduced in his dreams and reproduced in his alchemical work as well.
So you think they ritualized this? They formalized it symbolically?
Oh, I think they did. I think that they had a very strong working partnership. I mean, it obviously is that Vaughan admits as much, and they worked together in the laboratory, which meant that they worked together in a spiritual capacity as well. Vaughan is extremely spiritualized in his work. I mean, excessively so, even though he's talking about using sexual terms constantly. We in the West are not used to this. You know, we in the West think religion is over here and sex is over there, never the twain shall meet. But in India and in China, there is no such division.
And among the spermagnostics in
Right.
our Western culture too, before they were wiped out, of course.
Sure. Yeah.
But speaking of gold, many alchemists, even though it wasn't their primary goal, although many kings and royalties tried to encourage, bribe, or even force them to do it, many of them did make gold.
Well, yeah.
Again, not as the main focus, but I mean, if you first master the principles of nature, why not also use it like that? My question regarding Thomas is that if you know if there were any rumors about him having achieved that.
Yeah, I mean, people did claim that he did. In fact, one of his associates claimed that Vaughan had discovered the stone. I mean, there was no doubt in his mind that Vaughan had done this, and that was one of the reasons why, along with the death of his wife, that Vaughan suddenly removed himself from society in general. I mean, he was just not heard from again. He never made a big splash. As a writer, he would gleefully go on the attack against people who attacked him. And there were alchemists who attacked him and said he was full of crap, that he didn't know what he was talking about, which is a common thing among alchemists. They're always doing that to each other. You sometimes wonder if it's a ludibrium of some kind. It's a kind of a game that they play.
Yeah.
Because they just delight in saying, you don't know anything, and each one says you don't know anything, and that just goes on and on in circles. So he was a very enthusiastic participant in these discussions, and he attacked Thomas More, and he attacked all kinds of other people who were attacking him. I mean, he was a crazy man. And then suddenly, at a certain point, he disappears from the scene completely. He's politically safe at this point. He's not running from, Cromwell or anything. He's fine. He's not in jail. He was in jail under Cromwell for a while, but now he's fine. He seems to be self-sufficient economically, financially, whatever. He has a secure place working for the court, but he basically falls out of the public eye completely. And one of the people who worked with him, who knew him, said he had discovered the stone. And there's an implication that because his wife was not there to share that accomplishment with him, that there was some maybe a sense of guilt or a sense of sadness connected with it. It's just hinted at briefly that there might have been some connection that way, but we just don't know for sure. It's one of the great enduring mysteries. What happened to Rebecca? And why did Kenneth Rexroth say that it was their experiments that killed her? So I've done a lot of research on that, on what Rexroth called unguided autonomic nervous system experiments, and came to the conclusion that there are cases around the world where this has happened in modern times, when this has happened, when people have died because of doing yoga in an impossibly aggressive way. With this in mind. So
Yeah, traditionally the dry path has been said to, yes, it's quicker, but it's also more dangerous.
Yes.
And that the humid path will be safer, but it will take a longer time. And you will always have these people, maybe it's ADHD people, who say, screw the long way, I'm taking the risks.
Oh, yeah.
and any alchemist with any respect for himself has to go out either by a laboratory blow or just disappearing a la Nicolas Flamel or whatever. So, and here we have both in this story. He did disappear at some point, but I made a point out of that both of them had these accidental deaths connected to their work, which, by the way, is, of course, a very strong indication that they were onto something, that they were so devoted and genuine in their work that it did involve risks. I mean, only an obsessed guy, a devoted guy, will continue his work with the risk of his own life, right?
Sure.
But do you have any thoughts about what may have caused? You said they worked with Mercury, and that's so interesting because, as you may know, Mercury has often been popping up in connection to dimension openings, like in anti-gravity, a time machine. You have the double rotations that go the opposite way to kind of trick, in my layman's terms, how our dimensions are wired, because then you get, you put up forces against forces and see what happens, kind of. And Mercury is always involved. I think Farrell told me once that in an ancient Chinese text they talked about Mercury in relation to time and time travel and stuff like that. So, or was it space travel? So Mercury has always been, and also in classical alchemy, that's very often mentioned, but many alchemical works say, no, when we're talking about Mercury, we're not really talking about the, what they call the vulgar version, Quicksilver.
Right.
So what do you make out of all this?
Well, it seems as though Thomas Vaughan died handling real Mercury. I mean, the Mercury that we know. That might be just a way of saying something else. However, we don't know. One of the stories has he died from poisoning by Mercury. Another has him blowing up. So even the stories about his death, which were written at the time, contradict each other. So we don't know exactly how he died. Did he ingest something, or did he blow himself up?
Or did he retire?
Or did he simply retire like a Nicholas Flamel or a Falconelli? That which is also possible. Because we don't really know what happened to Thomas Vaughan after that. We don't know about where he was buried. I don't think there's a gravesite for him that has a body in it. So Henry Vaughan was a different story, but Thomas Vaughan, I just don't know. Rebecca Vaughan also was very hard to find. So the Mercury aspect, yes, Mercury is both a symbol and it's also the actual substance. When you're working in an alchemical laboratory, you're going to work with mercury regardless. I mean, the actual physical substance, because you're going to start there. Like you said, the letters of the alphabet, you have to start somewhere. So you're going to start with salt and sulfur and mercury. And you're going to see the interactions between these chemicals, and you're going to see chemical changes that take place. And these chemical changes are referenced in the alchemical text different ways, but you're going to understand suddenly what they mean by the green dragon or, the red lion. These things are going to become obvious when the chemical actions take place in front of you. But then you, at the same time, you realize, okay, well, now what? Now this has happened. I saw this. Okay, cool. Now where do I go from here? And that's where the real alchemy comes in. These little tricks of the laboratory. I mean, I used to have a chemistry set when I was a kid. That was something every kid my age had back in the 1950s. You would get a Gilbert chemistry set, and you had test tubes and lots of different chemicals, and they told you mix this with this and watch what happens, right? And things would happen. Things would foam up, or things would spark, or things would change color. And that was your introduction to chemistry. But it's also introduction to alchemy. It's these things that have no color in and of themselves. When you combine them, they change color, or they foam up, or they start to spark, or they do different things. And this is your introduction to the theories of process. You get the right things together in the right combinations, and then you watch what happens. And this is just your introduction. Like I say, it's the gateway drug. So, yeah. And at a certain point, though, when you understand that the real Mercury, our Mercury, philosophical Mercury, is not the vulgar Mercury. At a certain other level, you get past that and you go back to the real Mercury, because now you're looking for something else. And that might have been what happened to Vaughan, because Vaughan is very clear in his writings that it's not what you think it is. And it's not regular mercury, and it's not regular lead and sulfur and salt. These are other substances. He says that explicitly in his writings. Then why is he fooling around with mercury in his laboratory years later? So there's the Zen thing of the mountains and rivers. You go through that, and you begin to look at the actual chemicals you were playing with when you were a kid, and you look at them with new appreciation that there's something else going on there.
Yeah, that's for sure. We are closing up to the end here. We've talked about, you say something in your book about the problem. And in that same chapter, you do talk about what we talked about here, our mercury, our sulfur, in the process of seeking the elixir vitae. What would you say is, what does this refer to in your book? The problem, an outline of the problem.
Oh, the problem is basically, what is alchemy? What is the transformation? What does that even mean? What is the alchemy? What's the basis for this whole thing? The problem is that alchemical texts are written for alchemists. They're not written for general people.
Yeah, they're manuals from to colleagues, from one scientist to another.
Exactly. They're only for colleagues. They're not for the people in the street, which is why the people, the average person can't understand a word that's in them. The Surrealists loved alchemy. André Breton wrote about it.
And the symbolists.
And the symbolists. Max Ernst wrote about alchemy. Alchemy influenced his work tremendously. Even Salvador Dali. And everybody was all the alchemists and the symbolists were fascinated by alchemy because alchemy was this meta language. They at first were attracted to it because the symbolic language was kind of trippy. It was sort of like you were on drugs or something. And then later they began to see a logic to it. It was the language of dreams. So they're right to a certain extent, and I'm fascinated by the Surrealists, and I've studied the Surrealists for years. I'm always reading about Surrealism and studying Surrealist art because of that connection. They understood the connection between art and the psyche, and alchemy. And this is like a missing piece for my own research as Surrealism. So I've studied.
So did the Symbolism. I've studied them, not the Surrealists. But all you said now about the Surrealists can be said about the Symbolists too.
Yes, certainly. But the subject was too vast. I figured I'd focus just on the Surrealists.
Yeah. Okay.
And especially Max Ernst and André Breton. I mean, their writings were so rich with this material, and of course they were influenced by Freud, and they were influenced by the new science of psychoanalysis. So this to me was just fascinating. Very rich, creative vein, but a lot of them they sort of missed the point. The alchemical language is a very deliberate language. It's not just guys writing stream of consciousness, which is what Surrealists seem to think it was. It was not stream of consciousness. This was a meta language. This was a coded language, but it was using English or whatever the vernacular was to communicate things that ordinary language either was not able to communicate or which was too dangerous to communicate in regular language. And so that's the outline of the problem there for me. How do we decode Thomas Vaughan's writings, especially when Kenneth Rexroth says Thomas Vaughan gives the show away? He reveals it. So what does that mean? So I had to go back and say, this is the problem. The problem is the language. And we're going to look at Twilight language. We're going to try to understand this type of language because the alchemists in India and China use the same language. They use the same terms, and they use the same coded instructions in their own language. So there's an alchemical language in Chinese. There's an alchemical language in Sanskrit. And it's the same language. They're using the same terminology.
Yeah, you say that, but it's weird because from my studies in other fields of esoteric where there's been compersion, let's say take the elements, for instance, or let's say take anything actually, like death studies, the Bardo, the death books of different cultures, you'll see a very huge problem when it comes to esoteric streams within different religions, namely that they do apply different, I say languages than symbols, and that what makes sense within the context of one and what makes sense within the context of another will apparently be in dissonance. But if you dig deep enough in both, then there's no point riding several horses at the same time.
Yeah.
So choose one, stick to it, and go deep. But if you would, again, like you say, it's in Zen, right? First the water is water, then it's not, and then it's back to being. A stone is a stone and a water is water. And that's kind of the same thing here, that if you go deep enough, you go through all the differences and you will come back to a reconnection. But if that's a truism, then it sounds very counterintuitive that you now say that, no, it's downright tangible, the same thing they're talking about. Really? And I don't doubt it, but even though they operate within completely different reference points, symbology and religion, that sounds so very, then it must have been very practical, very down to what you can take and touch for that to be accomplishable.
Sure, I can understand that's the takeaway. But I would clarify it by saying that religions and cultures are constantly at war with each other, but mystics understand each other.
Yeah.
Mystics communicate. And it's not necessarily because what they do is as tangible as chemistry, but it is tangible to them. So a Jewish mystic and a Tibetan mystic can have a conversation and understand each other perfectly when they describe mystical states.
Oh, they don't even have to describe mystical states. They can, at the surface, if you're like a little Benjamin with big ears, they can talk about the weather, and they have just conveyed deep alchemical secrets to each other.
Exactly. And they don't share the same context, right? But they do share the same experience. And that's what alchemy, that's what I believe this language is all about. As I say, it's about a process rather than about specific items. They're using the specific items as symbols to describe the process. And the difference, the thing is that's striking to me, is they're using the same symbols across the board. They're using, for instance, the retort and the crucible. You'll find retorts and crucible and Mercury referenced in Chinese, Indian, and Western alchemy. And the difference being that in China and India, they're placing the crucibles and the retorts and the Mercury, etc., in the human body as a map, whereas in Western alchemy, of course, it's in the laboratory. But it's the same symbolism. We're trying to transmute this. We have a prima materia. We're going to refine it. It's going to become something else. We're going to create another kind of substance out of the wedding of these substances. Tantra is all about the chemical wedding. That's really what it is an enactment of. So there's something that's basic to humanity. It's basic to nature. It's basic to it's basic to creation. An ongoing process that they've all seen the same way. And they're all communicating with each other in this incomprehensible language to us, but they are communicating with each other, and they are using the same symbols to do it. It's like math. Basically, math would be the same no matter where you are, right? At least in the present day.
No, they go as far as to say that if there was one language that any being in the universe could communicate with each other, which is what mainstream science says about this, it would be math.
Right.
Because it's so universal, it's so irregardless of human culture, religion, notions, ideas. And it's actually my approach to the mystical. I prefer approaching it through numbers. Call it maybe the Pythagorean way.
Right.
So I'm with you there. But when you say that we're talking about words and meaning, I have to add, and you haven't said this yourself, and you should do it when you talk about the book in different interviews. I recommend that for the advertisement effect, that you say that you actually have a very rich glossary in the book that belongs to the story here. I've been browsing through it, and it's quite impressive and enticing. It makes me even more want to read the book because I realize, what you're touching here. And it's very useful for those who are not that trained in what we're talking about. If we have listeners here who are not that into esoterics, we will come off here as two nerds. But get this book, you will get then also the glossary, which in itself is valuable. It's a huge glossary, many pages, and it will actually teach you the basic words you need to know to operate within any field of esoterica, be that Occidental or Oriental, I'd say.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, it combines Chinese and Sanskrit and Kabbalistic and various other terminology, so you can see exactly what's being
Egypt, everything
is there.
Yeah. Very good, very good. So you take no chances. You're going to spoon feed us this story here.
Sure.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Sure. Well, I did that with The Dark Lord also, the book about Lovecraft and Crowley and Kenneth Grant.
Okay, I haven't read it, but I heard about it.
The idea. Well, I did that. I felt that I was going to make a contribution to this discussion because Grant would mention a lot of these tantric terms, but he wouldn't really describe them or enumerate them. So I said, okay, what I'm going to do in my book on Grant is I'm going to give you an actual listing of some of the things that he talks about that he doesn't describe. So at least there'll be something useful in the book if you didn't like anything else that I wrote.
Right.
And that Grant talks about the 16 kalas, these feminine essences of the female body that are different at different times of the day or the month, and et cetera, et cetera. They're used for occult purposes in Grant's system, but he nowhere describes what they are. He doesn't list them out. He just says there's 16. Okay, now what? So I went through, I found the names for them, I found the descriptions, and I went through and gave an explanation of all of that for those who are still using the Grant Typhonian magic system. And, things like that I feel add to the value of a book. In the Hitler Legacy, I gave the entire address book of Hans Ulrich Rudel, right, which was captured and found and has all the names of all of his Nazi compatriots around the world, basically an Odessa file all in itself with names, addresses, and phone numbers.
Wow.
So I always like to try to do that, to try to add something that's going to be, that you're not going to find anywhere else, basically. Whether you agree with my approach to the material or not, there'll be something in there you'll find that, okay, I can use the book for this,
So you are a rebel after all, because traditionally the alchemist explained the obscure with the even more obscure.
Sure.
But you're deviating from that route.
I'm trying.
Thank God.
Yes, I'm trying.
To our benefit. Before we end this, I have another question which may not seem to be relevant at all, but I find it interesting, and that is what do you make of, we talk about dreams, consciousness. What do we make of ayahuasca?
Well, I haven't taken ayahuasca myself, but I've taken a lot of other stuff. I've taken mushrooms and LSD once, or almost by a mistake, actually, which is a funny story. But anyway, there was mushrooms on more than one occasion, and ayahuasca, I'm guessing, is going to would have similar. Of course, all herbs are different, all drugs are different, and different effects. And LSD is quite different from psilocybin, for instance, for mushrooms.
But the interesting thing about ayahuasca is that it helps the DMT production.
Sure, yeah.
So do you think it has a role within modern alchemy?
Well, everything that exists has a role in modern alchemy. That's been my point from the beginning. It's all about the process.
Touché.
But, it has a specific role, perhaps, sure. I mean, DMT, I think, my experience for instance, on psilocybin, on mushrooms, on the actual ingesting the mushrooms themselves, was valuable, and it only needed to be done once, because what it does is it trains you, it teaches you that you can look at the world very differently than the way that you're used to, and that you can see things much more vivid and much more startling and much more luminous, and that this is one way of seeing creation. And that, to me, it proves it to you using your own nervous system to say, look, this is what you're going to see. That alone is enlightening, not to put too fine a point on it. That alone is an initiation. I mean, when you abuse it, of course, then you've lost the effect of it. But if with psilocybin, it was a question of opening up this. I'm beginning to confuse, hearing with seeing, with feeling. But at the same time, I'm looking at a Tibetan tanka that I had on the wall. I see it in absolute motion. And then I can say, oh, this is what was meant. This is what they tried to do with, this elaborate mandala with the god stamping on the lotus blossom altar. This was all suddenly in motion. This was all happening like a cartoon. And you could see it and think, oh, wow, this is what was intended. Or you could see the colors and realize this is the effect they were going for. So this kind of illumination is valuable, and I think the DMT experience is valuable for that reason too. I mean, all that I've read about DMT seems to argue exactly the way I would argue for psilocybin, but perhaps more so. So this molecule, I think it's a way of training the nervous system, or at least training consciousness that your nervous system is capable of so much more than you give it credit for, that you're using it for.
Yeah, and as Joseph Farrell said in a philosophical show we did with him, is that relearning is done by attributes, by the analogical thinking. And in that way, synesthesia phenomenon that can be induced by psychoactive drugs, it's healthy because we learn to translate. We're so stuck in the ordinary translation that, the vibrations that touches my nose, the smell vibrations are experienced as that. Completely different and distinct from the vibrations I pick up with my fingertips, the tactile vibrations, again different from the visual, from the sound, etc. So
sure.
When we get shaken out of that and we have to start to look for new connections, because that's inherent in human nature, trying to look for relations and connections, that's the problem with pareidolia, right? So but we get that synesthesia experience where it can make sense still, even though we bypass the ordinary routes of connections. Logic, I guess we could call it. So, or rationality. And here we have an irrational way to get to the truth. Maybe this is more of a humid way than a dry way. But you know what I'm saying here.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I agree. I mean, that is I would say the humid way probably. And it's a training. It's It's a training of the consciousness. It says, okay, my consciousness is capable of so much more. Actually, it trains your conscious mind to understand what the nervous system is all about, which again brings us back to the autonomic nervous system. Our autonomic nervous system is set up to interpret the world a certain way, and our nervous system in general is set up that way. What if we throw a monkey wrench into the works, right? What is it going to do? How is it going to react? How will it rewire itself to accommodate this new experience? I think it's valuable because the experience of the supernatural, the direct experience of something supernatural, is different yet again. Like with DMT or with psychoactive drugs, you're taking a substance which is deliberately rewiring you a little bit to show you something else. But then if you're totally stone cold sober and you have a supernatural experience, you'll understand the difference between the two. And I think that's also quite valuable, is to know that you're not hallucinating, right? When you have this experience, you're not on drugs, you're not drunk, you're not stoned. You are having an experience that has got nothing to do with the substance you've ingested, but with something that's taking place in front of you. That's something that's another thing, another event that's taking place that you have to get on board somehow, that you cannot now blame on drugs or alcohol.
No, I usually say that if you induce a hallucination or a paranormal experience, it's like looking out the window. But when you develop an ability to attain a particular condition or a state of mind or a level of vibration, then it's owned. It's going out the door.
Yes.
It's not just peeking out the window.
Exactly.
It's something you experience.
Exactly.
But in the ancient, some ancient Greek esoteric traditions, they had they had what they called earth heads. That's the people who couldn't so easily manipulate their own nervous system and trigger something in, let's say, the third eye in the pineal gland that would make them look into other dimensions. So they allowed them to experiment. It's like they had drugs, what we now call drugs, but methods that could bypass, that could accelerate or help them gain those window sights because they were earth heads and needed a little help.
Sure.
Be that it was inhalation of some natural gas coming out of the earth, or if it was certain plants, even marijuana. It could be mushrooms, like you said. It could be fungus. It could be the mystical thing called soma. Anything that they knew to. So that it wasn't, even then they didn't say this is the way, like many in the counterculture, young people, ever since your generation actually.
Right.
And up till to now, many of them mistake this for the real experience, and in a way the baby is thrown out with the bathwater, if you see what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's a kind of an initiation, but it's not the end of the story. It just gets you started. That's about all that it is. You're perfectly right. I mean, my generation was the Timothy Leary turn on, tune in, drop out generation, right? And yeah, that was a big mistake. I mean, people doing 100 acid trips, are you kidding me? I mean, there was no reason for that. One was enough, and in some cases more than enough. You just needed that one. You needed to have your mind open to these possibilities. Then you went on from there.
Yeah. Like, look what's possible. Now go out and gain it by yourself.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I would say it belongs to the story that you have 4 other books. To those who are interested in this book, you should know that Peter has written by more than just Nazis. You have, like you mentioned earlier, Tantric Temples, Eros and Magic in Java. That's from 2011. The next occult book would be The Angel and the Sorcerer from 2012.
Yeah, I guess that's about Mormonism. That's about the origin of the LDS Church.
And there's occult connections there too, right?
Well, yeah, I was fascinated by the figure of Joseph Smith and the fact that he was using basically Francis Barrett's The Magus in order to summon that angel that talked to him.
That I didn't know.
Well, and it's the same text that really started off the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons and everybody else. I mean, there's this continuum, this idea that Francis Barrett had that, and Francis Barrett was really a rehash of Agrippa, and so we go back to that. But I was fascinated by the figure of Joseph Smith, the talismans that were found on his body when he was killed, his show stones, like Dee and Kelly. He's staring at these show stones to get the Book of Mormon translated, quote unquote. All of this stuff that to me was fascinating about Joseph Smith. He was an occultist and a Freemason and all the rest of it. So.
Okay, so it's true what the conspiracy buffs say about him then. I've always written him off as an idiot, as a con man. But, and he may have been, but he may have been more...
Being a magician and a con man is not mutually exclusive, you know.
Yeah. More like the Crowleyan con man, the archetypal fool maybe, I don't know. But, well, I put him in the same category as the Hubbard guy, Scientologist. I have more respect for a guy like Crowley than Hubbard, actually, because Crowley was honest in his, should we say, rebellion. Then you have the Dark Lord that you mentioned, H.P. Lovecraft, Kenneth Grant, and the Typhonian tradition in magic from 2013. Pretty recent book, that.
Yeah.
So you go really into the dark places, and... Then we have, this is the first of them actually, from 2008 you have Stairway to Heaven, which maybe is the most relevant here, Chinese alchemists, Jewish Kabbalists, and the art of spiritual transformation.
Yeah.
I should have you on for that book. We're already in that area now.
Yeah, actually, and that's based on my master's thesis, and it's in a much expanded form of my thesis. With a lot of the stuff that they told me to keep out, I put it back in and publish it as Stairway to Heaven, and that focuses on specifically the role that the North Star, the Pole Star, played in religion, and the Ursa Major and the Big Dipper. Wow. I translate a lot of Egyptian and other religious traditions with their 7 stages leading to immortality in terms of that constellation for very serious reasons. I mean, they're actually referenced directly in many cases. It's just that we've missed it. We haven't paid attention to it. So I've gone back and I've looked at it and said, okay, this is what they were talking about. They were talking about really ascending the stars, and really going to the pole star, because everything seemed to circle around it. It was immortal. It never went below the horizon. So that's what Stairway to Heaven is about. I'm very proud actually of Stairway to Heaven. It was, done as an academic work, but it's not that inaccessible.
No, I should read it. That's for sure. This is a reason that you have a big occult following. I think you've been a little underestimated on your tribute to the esoteric literature, but we'll see if we can do something about that. I just also want to hurry to add that even in Shakespeare, you'll find references to constellations in the sky.
Sure,
that's some of the codes that. Also has been confirmed by the findings of Peter Amundsen that I mentioned in the beginning of the show. And listeners, this show, although it's a part of a philosophical series, could also be listened to in context of our series that I mentioned in the beginning, From Solomon's Temple to Arcadia, because it fits so neatly into that story. And Thomas Vaughan, he was a man in the middle, I'd say, between the first generation who created all this stuff, Bacon and the Shakespeare project, and then today. So go listen to that, and also go get Peter's book, which again is called
The Tantric Alchemist.
Yeah, and the subtitle is Thomas Vaughan.
Yes, Thomas Vaughan and the Indian Tantric Tradition.
Right. Okay, Peter, it's been time flies. I thought we would be going for 1.5. It seems we've gone for 2.5.
Yeah.
So I see what you mean the last time when you said that we need a little time for this show.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we still have only scratched the surface, I'm sure. I'll find out. I'll be one of those who will go in line to buy your book. So thank you very much for coming on again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for tuning in to Forum Borealis. Hope the topic today wasn't too niche for your interest. But if you fancy what we've been exploring today, let me remind you that we actually also discuss this exact matter in another program we had with Peter in the beginning of part 2 of the show called Hitler's Ratlined that you will find online. And as a bonus to this video, because it is fairly short, we include that part here in order to wrap up and complete this topic of the Tantric Alchemist. you have a new book out now. I want to give a little attention towards that. What's that book called and what is it about?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about it. My latest book has just come out. It's on the Welsh alchemist Thomas Vaughan. It's called The Tantric Alchemist. And the subtitle is Thomas Vaughan and the Indian Tantric Tradition. And what this is about, it's a study that I've been involved with since, believe it or not, 1968.
Wow.
Which is when I became involved in this. I read a book when I was a teenager called Thomas Vaughan, Mystic and Alchemist, The Works of Thomas Vaughan, Mystic and Alchemist. It was by the famous English occultist Arthur Edward Waite. But basically what it was just a compilation of Thomas Vaughan's writings. He was an alchemist of the 18th century. And it had a foreword by a famous American author called Kenneth Rexroth. Kenneth Rexroth was sort of a philosopher. He's considered by some to be the father of the beatniks. He was a guy who was very involved in Asian religion and Zen and that sort of thing, which was very popular back in the day, back in the 1950s and 1960s in the United States. And his foreword to this book really intrigued me a great deal. He said that the works of Thomas Vaughan about alchemy were much more than what you might think, that in order to understand Thomas Vaughan's writings, you have to understand Indian Tantra, you have to understand yoga, Chinese alchemy, and that sort of thing. And I'm not going to tell you how that fits in because it killed them. In other words, Thomas Vaughan and his wife both died prematurely under mysterious circumstances. His wife died first, and then he died later. But it was a couple.
In France, right?
No, in England.
Oh, in England, okay.
In England, in London, actually. So you had a husband and wife team. They were both alchemists. This was unusual in and of itself. Thomas Vaughan credits his wife with a lot of discoveries, but she dies of a mysterious illness, and then a few years later he dies in what appears to have been an explosion involving mercury. We don't know the details because there's conflicting reports about that. Anyway, I was very intrigued because Rexroth says, listen, Thomas Vaughan gives the show away when it comes to alchemy. He actually reveals the whole thing if you can understand what he's saying. If you can read, between the lines, understand the code, you'll understand what happened and what alchemy is all about. And then he ends it like that, so you're stuck with this. And I was, as I say, I was 18 years old. I read this and I said, well, I've got to find out what this is all about. And that began, decades of research, sometimes conducted furiously for weeks or months at a time, and other times just when I had time to do it along with everything else. But I went to school to learn Mandarin Chinese in order to read Chinese alchemical texts that had not been translated yet. I did a lot of that. It took me around the world. I wound up going all over Asia. I wound up going all over Europe, South America, everywhere. And every time I did go to a different country, I had another agenda. I could look this up or look that up or talk to these people. So I managed to mix business with business, you might say, and keep doing this. So finally, I decided, I could keep researching this the rest of my life. Let me put down between two covers what I've already uncovered about this, and to demonstrate to people that if they were to pay attention to just the recent books that have come out, the recent studies in the last 10 or 15 years on Indian alchemy and on Chinese alchemy, if they were to read those, and I give guidance where that's concerned, you can then turn right around, read Thomas Vaughan, and, the beam will fall from your eyes. You'll be able to read Thomas Vaughan like you're reading a tantric text, not just an obscure alchemical text with lions and dragons and the Philosopher's Stone and all the rest. You'll be able to understand it.
Yes, I saw that. It's so interesting. I've never seen that combined with the Tantra.
Well, Tantra actually turned out to be the key towards understanding Western alchemy. Indian and Chinese alchemy used exactly the same terminology that's used in Europe for the European alchemy, except that in India and in China, the emphasis is on using those terms to refer to specific biophysical properties. It refers to things taking place in the human body as opposed to only in metals. So it suddenly became very easy to use their terminology, their concepts, to swing over to the Western alchemical texts and actually decode them. it suddenly became obvious that Western alchemy is really Tantra.
Okay, I can buy that. But in Western alchemy, they have this division where you can have several fields of study, where you have the metallic alchemy, obviously, right?
Yes.
You have the spagyrics, plant alchemy.
Yep.
Then you have the human alchemy, which is apparently what you're talking about here. The personal transformation in your body. And then you have what's most popular today, which is the symbolic,
Sure.
like spiritual alchemy, or it's all metaphors.
Yeah.
But the same principle for one area can be transferred to the other areas. And by the way, the bodily alchemy has been the weakest, as far as I've noticed, in the Western tradition. Unlike the Eastern, which, have yoga,
Sure.
Tai Chi, all these things. So what you're saying here is that you can actually decode Western alchemy also in a bodily alchemy
Yes.
aspect. That's incredible.
Well, it is, and it doesn't negate the other forms of alchemy. All forms of alchemy, all approaches are correct. Tantra is not strictly about the body only. And of course, it also takes in a Jungian, symbolic aspect. It takes in the metallic, the spagyric. All of that is included, especially in Indian alchemy, which covers all of those areas. So by understanding Indian alchemy, by reading some of the lately translated texts on Indian alchemy, it suddenly becomes very clear that you can do the same to Western alchemy. And Thomas Vaughan is the linchpin to all of this. He's the connection, because Vaughan really did write a lot about bodily alchemy, about psychobiological and biochemical processes, very thinly veiled in his texts. So it suddenly became quite obvious. Even the one illustration that he has, there's only one illustration of all of Thomas Vaughan's writings, and it's a magic mountain. And if you take that, as I did in my book, and compared it up against Chinese diagrams from the White Cloud Monastery in Beijing, which is a Taoist alchemical monastery, if you compare these two illustrations, they're actually talking to each other. They're the same illustration, just a Western context or a Chinese context, sort of step by step, to show why you can use Tantra and Chinese alchemy to understand it. So I think they have to digest this and then get back to me.
Yeah. So you actually provide this kind of key then to decode it?
Yes, I do.
Wow,
yep.
Cool. That's a must-have. But just quickly, when did Thomas Vaughan live?
In the 18th century. He was part of the entourage around the Stuarts. He was very involved with the Stuart monarchy, which was the Catholic monarchy that was kicked out briefly by Cromwell, and all of that during the English Civil Wars. And then he came back into favor when James, the Stuarts were restored during the Restoration. He worked for the king as an alchemist. Actually, he had an official position there. He was part of the group around the founding of the Royal Society. So he was a very well-known...
Right. So he was a Freemason too?
Well, I don't know if he was really a Freemason. That's not made very clear. But there's a lot of Masonic allegories in his work. Plus, he was very much involved with studying Rosicrucianism. He actually published the first English language translation of the Rosicrucian manifestos.
Yeah, right. Okay, I have so many follow-up questions.
Yes, right, exactly.
So I can then say that we're actually going to have later on, though, we're going to have a series on alchemy, so to speak. We're going to interview people like Adam McLean, Dennis Hawke, people
Sure.
who. So I suggest we do a program on this book, this finding too.
Why not?
Now, just to tip you about this, in case you haven't noticed, there is some very fresh revelations now regarding the Rosicrucians. We've had 2 programs on it already. And I know there's claims about this, every year there's a new book about this, but this time it's the real deal. It's a bunch of people who has decoded... they have decoded, among else, Shakespearean works and also some classical alchemical works and Rosicrucian manifestos. And it all seems that, to make a long story short, there is this so-called treasure map. It's a Templar treasure. It's led them to Nova Scotia. It involves King James. It involves the Invisible College, Francis Bacon. It's very interesting. It seems that the Rosicrucians really was a project, a proto-Masonic project. But I'll not ramble more about this now. It's just to give you a tip about that. And the listeners who are interested in that, go check our programs about this. Now, you've noticed we've allowed brief YouTube commercials in our videos on the tube to help cover our costs, but it's a drop in the ocean compared to the means we get from our generous sponsors. That's our main backing that allows this to be brought to you. And let me remind those of you who have contributed to financing us that if you sign up at our website, you get access to many more shows not yet released, as well as extra stuff, among else forum talks where we address questions and comments from our very insightful listenership. Before closing for the night, I want to share a quote from Peter's book on the nature of information that we briefly mentioned today. It is inevitable that a loss of faith in media would contribute to a loss of faith in the content itself. Where writing began as divine communication and literacy was the privilege of a very few, writing and the media to promote and publish that writing is now accessible to everyone, even to the functionally illiterate. This means that the quality of available information has been degraded considerably, along with the structural weakness of primary and secondary school education. It is now difficult to determine between what is investigative journalism, for instance, and what is baseless conspiracy theorizing. As no demands are made on the writers of media content, the demands have correspondingly increased on the readers of that content to practice a form of what fundamentalist Christians call discernment, to greater and lesser degrees of success. And naturally, we have to close with quoting Thomas Vaughan himself. I present thee here with a positive express of principles as I find them in nature. It is not the vomit of Aristotle, which his followers with so much diligence lick up and swallow. I intend not the conquest, but the exercise of thy reason. Not that thou shouldst swear allegiance to my dictates, but compare my conclusions with nature, and examine their correspondence. Be pleased to consider that obstinacy enslaves the soul and clips the wings which God gave her for flight and discovery. It is an age wherein truth is near a miscarriage, and it is enough for me that I have appeared thus far for it in a day of necessity. Have thy heart in heaven, and thy hands upon the earth. Ascend in piety, and descend in charity, for this is the nature of light, and the way of the children. With these winged words I bid you adieu. As always, your host has been Al, and until our paths cross again, I remain yours sincerely. Be seeing you.
Who is number one?